Talk about some other buildings and just kind of keep going. We can kind of gather up here. I think we get a good view of this building and the Thompson House as I know it. The courthouse in Oxford is the third, at least, and it probably is just the third building to occupy the site. Apparently the first building was a fairly temporary wooden structure built about 1837 or so, shortly after the town was incorporated. Served as the first courthouse for a few years. Sometime later, brick, two-story, very substantial, very elegant Greek Revival courthouse was constructed. Unfortunately, we don't yet know the name of the architect, but we have theories that architectural historians are continually researching to see who did what. But it unfortunately burned in 1864, I think it was, during the Civil War. Well, in the early 1870s, they constructed this. This architect also did the courthouse in Holly Springs and one in Bolivar, Tennessee. They're very similar. Of course, you can look at them now and see how they've been altered and changed and added on to over the years. You can see this building is what we refer to as a Greco-Italianate, sort of a transitional architectural style, if you will. And that's one thing that's very difficult as an architectural historian. Very few buildings, especially a vernacular or a local built building, is going to have a pure style. It's going to be a mixture of things, what was popular locally, so you do the best you can. Some buildings, however, just defy terminology. You just can't find a name for that style. But this is a very nice, high-style, sort of Greco-Italianate, if you will. Now, I say Greco, meaning Greek Revival. You'll notice how the elevation of the original building, which is the center part around the portico, the elevation is broken up by these large, thin strips of masonry that break forward. They're pilasters, basically flat columns almost pushed into the wall. And it gives the effect, the appearance of columns encircling a building. And Greek Revival architecture, the idea behind that was we're going to revive the architecture of the ancient Greeks and we're going to build new temples. And if you know about the ancient Greek architecture, they built with stone, first of all, and a lot of their temples had what we call peripteral colonnades, which means columns going all the way around the building. Some had it just on the front and the rear, but a lot of the Greek temples did have it around all four sides. That's very expensive. It takes a lot of skill and a lot of stone or brick to do all of that. So what you see happening later by architects reviving, even in some of the ancient Greek buildings, to give that impact, they would use the pilaster to give the effect of the columns circling the building. So that's really the primary Greek Revival influence on this building. The rest of the details, though, are much more Italianate. And Italianate was the style that followed the Greek Revival, which was very severe and very strong and very masculine. Italianate's a little more elegant, a little more feminine. It's Italianate, meaning it's inspired by the architecture of the countryside in Italy that was very informal and had arches and a little bit of classical architecture there. It was much more picturesque, meaning made a pretty picture, which was very important in the mid-19th century. They want everything to be very beautiful and very natural, very picturesque. So you see Italianate being a little bit softer. You see the arches on the entrance there, the portico. That's a very Italianate effect. You'll notice the very heavy brackets along the eaves there, and the heavier modillions right above the pilasters, modillion brackets really. And then where the chimneys come above there where the pilaster is, all incorporated with a nice little panel effect of the chimneys to really decorate those. And the very elaborate Corinthian columns there on the portico itself. Again, you find Corinthian columns certainly in Greek Revival architecture, but you still see it some in Italian. So this, and then of course the wonderful clock tower with the arcading on that. It's just a very elegant, beautiful building. Sitting right in the middle of the square, right in the middle of the town, in the middle of the county, you know, a perfect example of that. The two bays on either side of the centerpiece, and a bay is a door window opening, were added in the mid-20th century. The county outgrew the courthouse, they needed space, and thankfully they didn't tear it down and build a new one. And the additions they made, while certainly not ideal, are much better than they could have been. They at least respect what was there, keep the fenestration, the pattern of the windows going. They put the pilaster effect kind of in there in the middle. You kind of see where they would have been, even though they really aren't, but you kind of know what's going on. And that's another good thing. When you make an addition to a historic building, you simplify the original details, you pay homage to them, you say, yes, we recognize that was there, but we're not trying to exactly replicate what was there historically. We're trying to make the building look new, but blend in. And I think overall, they probably did a pretty good job with that, given the constraints they had to work with, probably about as good as they could have done. Now, we're going to look at a purer, if you will, example of Greek Revival, if I don't walk into the building first. But after the Civil War, the Thompson House here on the corner. three-story brick masonry building. One of the few buildings on the square over 1 or 2 stories. Was built sometime in the 1870s, but the most architectural defining characteristic of this building are the pilasters that go all the way around it. And you can really see well on that building the effect. The pilasters are picked out in a lighter color from the body of the building, which is painted a little bit darker, a lot darker in this case. So you really do get the effect that these are columns encircling a Greek building, a Greek temple. Very simple, very straightforward. Very little ornamentation, which is very typical of most Greek Revival architecture, certainly in small towns in Mississippi. Most of the time we think of Greek Revival as being an antebellum architecture, and antebellum does not mean big white columns. Antebellum means built before the Civil War, from the Latin antebellum. But Greek Revival did continue. It was a very popular style. In fact, buildings continued to be built in a Greek Revival vernacular form well into the 1870s and even the 1880s in some places. This is probably the purest example of Greek Revival architecture, commercial architecture certainly, on the square in Oxford. Unfortunately, we had part of the back fall off. But if you'll notice the architectural renderings, the architects are going to essentially recreate what was there and continue the building along the sidewalk as it always was historically. That's another issue that we face with preservation. When commercial buildings in downtowns are lost through fire or storm, or just the fact that they deteriorate to the point that they are not capable of being restored, we want to make sure that what's built back respects the streetscape, that it comes back to the sidewalk, that it's approximately the same height, that the materials are similar, so that as you continue down the sidewalk, you keep going with the urban feel of the street, that all of a sudden you don't come to a break and you got 20 feet back in the parking lot, and you don't want that. That really destroys the whole character of the district. You want it to hang together, so fortunately they're going to do that. And the buildings that you see up North Lamar, which are very large and possibly a little bit out of scale for some things on the square, they do at least respect that urban characteristic and the pedestrian-friendly nature that Oxford is so well known for. So we're going to walk across the street, and I'm not going to talk as I do that because I don't want to get hit. I don't want y'all to either. I'm going to stop and talk about some other things. Alright, now, as we walk through here, we're going to see a lot of different storefronts. And the storefront is the most altered part of a historic commercial building, period. It makes sense. It's the thing customers see the most often. It's the thing that gets the most wear and tear. It's the first way a merchant makes... I'm sorry, I talked right over that, didn't I? Sorry. The storefront is the first impression a merchant makes on his customers. And we all are guilty of that today. Whenever the latest store on the bypass or the mall redoes their front, we notice, oh, they must be doing well, they must be prosperous. Wow, they're, you get the idea that something good is going on because they've updated. So it's something that's always been done. And again, that creates some challenges for preservationists because some changes to historic buildings, while not 100 or 150 years old, the changes themselves are historic and need to be considered for possible preservation. Because you've got an historic storefront that may be 50 years old on a building that itself may be 150, but the 50-year-old storefront does have history, is significant, and is original material that, like we talked about at City Hall, in a lot of cases is going to be better quality and better manufacture than you can get today. And it's part of the history of the building as we see it progress through time. As Americans, we all want to go back to X period in a building's history and restore it exactly as George Washington slept in it, but that's not always possible. So, I wanted to point out something I noticed that I hadn't noticed before. Those transoms are pure glass or prism glass transoms. Another thing that you'll notice in storefronts, when these buildings were constructed originally, there was no electricity for lighting or heating or air conditioning. There was, in most cases, certainly in Oxford, not gas lighting even. Most of the lighting was by lamps, and it was pretty weak. And you see a lot of these buildings are long and thin, so you got to figure out a way to get light, natural light, into the back of these buildings. And one of the ways to do that was with transoms on the front to get as much glass out to the street, out to the sun. And some of these glass, not necessarily this, but some of it